For over a decade, my wife, Sarah, and I had built our lives in a modest yet comfortable house on the outskirts of San Antonio, Texas. The place wasn't extravagant by any stretch, but it was ours, completely paid off. We had closed out the mortgage 2 years ahead of schedule, a milestone that came with plenty of late nights, skipped vacations, and a shared determination to secure a stable future for our family. Every brick in that house felt like a victory, a symbol of the sacrifices we made to give our kids, Emma and Jake, a safe and happy home. The neighborhood had always been a sanctuary for us. Mornings were greeted by the scent of fresh coffee on the patio, while our golden retriever, Max, wagged his tail at passers-by. Weekends meant impromptu barbecues with neighbors who had become friends over the years. It was the kind of community where everyone respected each other's space, but came together when it mattered. No nosy complaints, no petty grievances about lawn heights, just an unspoken agreement to keep life peaceful. From the day we moved in, I made it a point to stay on top of all the bills and paperwork. Property taxes, insurance, utilities, it was all accounted for. One thing I knew for certain was that we weren't part of any homeowners association. Sure, there'd been some pamphlets handed out when we first moved in, but they seemed like voluntary community efforts, organizing potlucks or neighborhood cleanups, not the kind of HOA horror stories you'd hear about online. And honestly, that suited me just fine. We had enough on our plate, raising 2 kids and juggling careers without worrying about arbitrary rules or hidden fees. Life was good. Not perfect, but good. Sarah's laughter filled the house when she wasn't balancing her work-from-home job with keeping the kids on top of their school projects. Emma was starting middle school full of energy and curiosity, while Jake, our little adventurer, spent his afternoons climbing the old oak tree in the backyard. Even Max seemed content, bounding around the yard like he owned the place. We had found our rhythm, our little corner of happiness, and nothing seemed capable of disrupting it. At least, that's what I thought. It was a Wednesday afternoon, and I was wrapping up a particularly dull day at work when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. Normally, I'd let it go to voicemail, but for some reason, I picked up. The voice on the other end was calm, almost too calm. "Hi, is this Michael Carter?" the man asked. "Yes. Who's calling?" I replied, already bracing myself for some sales pitch or scam. "This is Justin Wilson. I'm the new owner of your property on Elmwood Drive." I froze, my mind racing to make sense of what he'd just said. "Excuse me?" I finally managed. "You must have the wrong person. I own that house. My wife and I paid it off years ago." There was a pause, long enough for my stomach to twist into knots. Then he spoke again, his tone steady but firm. "No mistake. The property was foreclosed on and sold at auction by the HOA. I purchased it for $215,000. According to the records, you were supposed to vacate by now." For a moment, I couldn't speak. It felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. "That's impossible," I snapped. "We don't owe anything to an HOA. We're not even part of one." "I suggest you check the records," he said, before hanging up, leaving me clutching the phone in disbelief. That night, I barely slept. My mind replayed the conversation over and over, each word cutting deeper. Foreclosed, sold, HOA, none of it made sense. We hadn't received a single letter, email, or notice about unpaid dues. How could our house, the house we worked so hard to pay off, be taken from us without our knowledge? The next morning, I drove straight to the county clerk's office, my pulse pounding the entire way. I half expected to be told it was all some horrible mistake. But as I scanned the records, my worst fears were confirmed. There it was in black and white, a foreclosure notice, the sale details, and the transfer of ownership, all tied back to supposed unpaid HOA fees. My hands trembled as I held the documents. The dates on the notices stretched back years, but we hadn't seen any of them, not one. I felt a mix of anger, confusion, and panic. How could this have happened? How could something so monumental slip through the cracks? My home, our sanctuary, was now someone else's property, and I had no idea how or why. Leaving the office, I called Sarah, my voice shaking as I explained what I'd found. She was just as stunned as I was, unable to believe that something so outrageous could be real. We had done everything right, or so we thought. But now it felt like the life we'd built was crumbling before our eyes, and we didn't even know where to start picking up the pieces. The next morning, fueled by equal parts caffeine and rage, I decided to confront the HOA directly. Surely this had to be some kind of administrative error. I pictured a disorganized office where a simple clarification would straighten everything out. But as I walked into their sleek, air-conditioned headquarters, I realized I wasn't going to find an apology waiting for me. A woman sat behind the front desk, her expression as disinterested as a DMV clerk on a Friday. I explained my situation, trying to keep my voice steady, though my frustration was evident. I need to understand how my house was foreclosed on without me knowing anything about it. She tapped at her keyboard for a moment, barely looking up. According to our records, she said in a monotone, we sent multiple notices regarding unpaid dues. Letters, emails, phone calls, all documented. I blinked. Documented? I've never received a single notice from you. No letters, no emails, no calls, nothing. She shrugged, her fingers still clicking lazily across the keys. Well, sir, the records show otherwise. It's not our fault if you ignored them. Ignored them. The audacity of her words made my blood boil. I didn't ignore anything because I didn't get anything. How is that my fault? She sighed as if I were an annoying customer asking for extra ketchup. You can request copies of the notices, but the foreclosure and sale have already been processed. There's nothing more we can do. Her indifference was infuriating. This wasn't some misplaced package or billing error. This was my home. I left the office, fists clenched, determined not to let this end here. Back in the car, I called Sarah, recounting the encounter while trying not to sound completely unhinged. She listened, her voice steady as she said, Mike, we need help. Someone who knows how to deal with this. That's how I found myself sitting across from Andrea Lawson, a sharp-eyed attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. Her office was cluttered but efficient, stacks of legal briefs and case files lining the shelves. As I told her everything from the bizarre phone call to the brush-off at the HOA office, she took meticulous notes, occasionally asking pointed questions. You're sure you've never received any correspondence from them? She asked, leaning back in her chair. Not a single thing, I said. No letters, no emails, no calls. It's like this foreclosure came out of nowhere. She nodded, her expression thoughtful. HOAs are notorious for this kind of behavior. Hidden fees, questionable notices, aggressive foreclosures. Let me take a look at the records. If they skipped even one step in the process, we'll find it. For the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of hope. Andrea wasted no time. She requested the HOA's documentation, county foreclosure filings, and anything else that could shed light on what had happened. Meanwhile, she advised me to gather every piece of evidence I had. Mortgage statements, property tax receipts, anything that could prove we were diligent homeowners. As the hours turned into days, Andrea began to uncover discrepancies. Notices that were supposedly mailed had no delivery confirmations. Email records were conspicuously absent. Phone logs showed calls made to a number that wasn't even mine. The deeper she dug, the more it became clear. The HOA story wasn't holding up. Sitting in Andrea's office one evening, I felt a mix of anger and determination. So, what does this mean? I asked. It means, she said, her tone firm, they've got a lot to answer for, and we're just getting started. The nights that followed were consumed by research. I pored over every legal forum, every article, and every case study I could find about HOAs and their questionable practices. It didn't take long to discover that my situation wasn't unique. Story after story painted a chilling picture of homeowners blindsided by fees they didn't know they owed or notices they never received. HOAs were exploiting loopholes and bending rules to snatch properties out from under unsuspecting families. The more I read, the angrier I became. I found cases where homes were foreclosed over unpaid fees as small as $100, and others where notification letters were conveniently lost in the mail. It was a predatory system, one that thrived on power imbalances and legal ambiguity. I couldn't help but wonder how many others had been steamrolled by this machine, too overwhelmed or too scared to fight back. Meanwhile, the phone calls from Justin Wilson, the so-called new owner of my house, began to escalate. At first, his tone was polite, almost apologetic. I understand this is a tough situation, he said one evening, but I've already invested a lot of money. I need you to vacate soon. The nerve of this guy. I'm not going anywhere. I shot back. This isn't just about you. This is about a corrupt HOA that broke the law. If you're smart, you'll stay out of it. The calls didn't stop. With each one, his frustration grew more apparent. You're making this harder than it has to be, he warned one night. I don't want to take legal action, but I will if I have to. It was hard not to let his words rattle me, but I refused to give him the satisfaction. I told Andrea about the calls, and she assured me we had a solid case. Let him talk, she said. Every threat he makes is just more leverage for us. Despite the mounting pressure, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about saving my home anymore. It was about exposing a system that preyed on people like me. The deeper I dug into my research and the more I worked with Andrea, the stronger I felt. If the HOA thought I would roll over, they were sorely mistaken. A week into the chaos, Andrea called me into her office. I could tell by her voice that she had found something significant. When I arrived, she motioned for me to sit as she spread out a pile of documents on her desk. "I've got them," she said, a flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. "The HOA's process is riddled with violations." She pointed to one document after another, explaining each flaw in detail. "First, they claim to have sent multiple notices to your address. But look at this. Half of those were mailed to a P.O. box that isn't yours. The other half have no delivery confirmations. They can't prove you ever received them." I leaned forward, my heart pounding. "So, they never legally notified me?" "Exactly," she said. "And it gets worse. The foreclosure paperwork wasn't filed properly. They skipped steps, didn't adhere to state requirements, and even undervalued your home significantly during the sale." Hearing this felt like a weight lifting off my chest. For the first time, I saw a clear path forward. "What does this mean for us?" "It means we have leverage," Andrea replied. "With these violations, we can not only challenge the foreclosure, but potentially file a lawsuit for damages. And I think there's more. We'll dig deeper." As if on cue, my phone buzzed. It was Justin Wilson, the supposed new owner. I hesitated but answered. His tone was different, no longer smug but uncertain, almost apologetic. "Listen," he started, "I've been looking into this and I didn't know. I didn't know the HOA might have done something illegal. I just thought I was buying a property fair and square. Now it seems like they used me." I was silent for a moment, surprised by the sudden shift. "So, what are you saying?" "I don't want to be part of this mess," he admitted. "If what you're saying is true, I don't want to fight you. I just want my money back. If there's a way to work together on this, I'm in." It was a strange feeling, relief mixed with vindication. Justin wasn't the enemy, he was another pawn in the HOA's scheme. I hung up and relayed the conversation to Andrea, who nodded thoughtfully. "That's good," she said. "If he cooperates, it strengthens our case. We'll need his testimony." From that moment, we shifted gears. Andrea began drafting the legal challenge, piecing together every misstep the HOA had made. The fight wasn't over, but now we had momentum, and for the first time, I started to believe that we could win. The courtroom was colder than I expected, both in temperature and atmosphere. As I sat at the plaintiff's table next to Andrea, I couldn't help but feel a mix of nerves and anticipation. This was it, the moment we'd been fighting for. Across the room sat the HOA's lawyer, an older man with a polished demeanor and a stack of files that looked taller than he was. Justin Wilson was there too, seated near the middle, his expression uneasy but resolute. The proceedings began with the HOA's lawyer making his case. He droned on about their adherence to standard procedure, their alleged attempts to notify me, and how they had followed the letter of the law. He pointed to their records, highlighting dates and supposed documentation that proved they had done everything by the book. At one point, he even suggested that I had been negligent in my responsibilities as a homeowner. I clenched my fists under the table, biting back the urge to interrupt. Andrea, calm and collected, leaned over and whispered, "Let him dig his hole." When it was our turn, Andrea wasted no time dismantling their arguments. She stood, radiating confidence, and walked the judge through each piece of evidence we had uncovered. "Your Honor," she began, holding up a stack of letters. "These are the notices the HOA claims were sent to my client. However, as you'll see, many were addressed to the wrong location, with no proof of delivery. Furthermore, the foreclosure paperwork contains glaring procedural errors. Steps required by state law were skipped entirely." She presented emails, phone logs, and financial records, all pointing to the same conclusion. The HOA had acted recklessly, cutting corners and abusing their authority. Andrea's tone was sharp, but never overbearing, each word landing with precision. Then came Justin's testimony. He admitted that when he purchased the property, he believed everything was above board. But after learning about the HOA's actions, he realized he had been misled. "I never intended to buy a house through dishonest means," he said, his voice steady but firm. "If I'd known what they were doing, I would have never gone through with it." His statement was a turning point. The judge's expression softened, and I could tell they were taking it seriously. As the HOA's lawyer tried to salvage his case, it became clear he was running out of steam. Each argument he made was countered by the mountain of evidence Andrea had built. Finally, after hours of testimony and cross-examination, the judge delivered their ruling. The actions of the HOA were not only procedurally flawed, but demonstrated a blatant disregard for the rights of the homeowner. They said, "The foreclosure is hereby annulled, and the property is to be returned to Mr. Carter immediately." A wave of relief washed over me, but the judge wasn't finished. Additionally, due to the emotional and financial strain caused by the HOA's actions, damages are awarded to the plaintiff. Hearing those words felt surreal. We had won, not just the house, but a measure of justice against an organization that had tried to steamroll us. As we left the courtroom, Andrea turned to me with a rare smile. "I told you we'd get them," she said. Walking out into the fresh air, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. The fight had been grueling, but the result made every sleepless night, every tense moment worth it. We had stood our ground, and we had won. The day we officially got the ruling in our favor felt like stepping into sunlight after weeks in a storm. The house was ours again, our home, the one we'd poured years of work and love into. But it wasn't just about getting the property back. The court had ordered the HOA to cover all our legal fees and pay $300,000 in damages for the stress, disruption, and financial burden they'd caused. For the first time in months, I felt like we could finally breathe again. Returning home that evening was surreal. As I stood in the driveway looking at the place where we'd built our lives, it didn't feel like a simple win. It felt like a reclamation of everything they'd tried to take from us. Sarah hugged me tightly, her relief palpable, while Emma and Jake ran into the house, their laughter ringing through the air. Even Max, our golden retriever, seemed to sense that the nightmare was over, bounding around the yard as if nothing had ever been wrong. News of our victory spread quickly. Local papers picked up the story, and neighbors started stopping by to congratulate us. Some shared their own quiet frustrations with the HOA, thanking us for standing up to them. It wasn't just our fight anymore. It had become a symbol of resistance against an unchecked system. As I sat on the porch that night, watching the sun set over the neighborhood, I felt a deep sense of closure. This battle had been about more than saving a house. It had been about standing up for what was right. And in the end, we didn't just reclaim our home, we reminded everyone that sometimes the little guy can win. Life slowly returned to normal after the dust settled. The house felt like ours again, not just physically, but emotionally. Each creak of the floorboards, every familiar corner of the backyard, it all carried a renewed sense of belonging. Sarah and I worked hard to restore the sense of peace that had been overshadowed by the chaos, focusing on the little joys of everyday life. Emma and Jake, blissfully resilient, as kids often are, seemed to bounce back with ease, diving into their routines as though nothing had happened. But for me, the fight had left an indelible mark. Sitting on the porch one quiet evening, I found myself reflecting on everything we'd been through. The battle with the HOA wasn't just about our home. It was about standing up against an unchecked system that had preyed on too many families for too long. Our case had shed light on abuses that often went unnoticed or unchallenged. It wasn't just a personal victory. It was a message. Neighbors began sharing stories of their own struggles with the HOA, finding strength in our example. I'd hear about small but meaningful changes happening in the community, people pushing back against unfair practices and demanding more transparency. Knowing that our fight had inspired others made all the sleepless nights, the stress, and the fear worth it. The settlement money helped ease the financial strain, but the real reward was the knowledge that we had made a difference. We had proved that you could challenge powerful organizations and win, that you didn't have to accept injustice simply because it came from an official-looking letterhead. As life moved forward, I carried with me a renewed sense of faith, not just in the system, but in the power of resilience and determination. Our story became more than a fight to save a home. It became proof that fairness and justice could still prevail if you were willing to fight for them. And that, to me, was the greatest victory of all.